Hey everyone, welcome back to Looking Outside. So this is episode number 3 in a series that we're doing live from Leipzig in Germany as part of the Rulebreaker Future Congress hosted by To Be Ahead. So mini conversations with some of the innovative, thought-provoking speakers that we've seen at the Congress, including a return appearance from my good friend, Roger Spitz. Hey, Rod.
Great to be back, Jo. In person even.
In person.
Look at that.
Yeah, so
IRL.
exciting. Yeah. So I think maybe this episode will go live before the full episode that I have with Roger. So this is almost going to be like a little teaser for the conversation that we're going to have. So we'll try to cover off some slightly different topics, but that also means that you have to introduce yourself again.
Great. So Roger Spitz, I'm the founding chair of the Disruptive Futures Institute in San Francisco, which is a think tank education company around topics of change, complexity, and foresight.
You probably don't need an introduction because most people know who Roger is. And you bring such a unique lens into this. And I think what I particularly loved about the Congress and having you here and having an opportunity to sort of share a stage was that you understand foresight and futures methods and the tools and the mindsets that are required to think about the future.
Yeah.
Because that's what the Congress was all about, right? It's like pushing everyone to 2035 and beyond. And you have that experience of saying, well, how do we do that?
Yeah. And that's the biggest challenge, right? A big challenge is imagining discontinuity in terms of a future or futures that are different from today, what they might look like, and to do that in a way that's helpful for building resiliency and to be future prepared. And so the imagination is also difficult and important. And then it's what are the tools that support to build that capacity to enhance resiliency and to be better future prepared for those possible changes and that.
Exactly. And that bit around navigating change, I think, is a really critical one, particularly with some of the themes that were touched on at the Congress, where there are so many different industries where people are feeling like change is not happening fast enough. So I guess I'm curious from your perspective, how much of change is around people lacking those tools and methods to enact a change versus a mindset shift?
Yeah, so change is a funny one because there are a lot of paradoxes and contrasts around change. The first one is something you hear often, is that change is slow, but I think that change is slow until it isn't. And the trick, which I call the inflection paradox, because a lot of the world is nonlinear and complex, exponential, the outputs can be very disproportionate to the initial change. Good or bad, it's not necessarily a negative thing. And that exponentiality means that there are two things that are happening which trick your mind, and that's why we often, I think, miss change. And that's why it's the feeling of it's slow, but then you suddenly get caught. I think the first one is just simply the exponential profile, because the exponential profile, most people studied it, understand it, you learned it at school, but actually we're not cabled. We're cabled in a linear way. So think COVID, initially it's like, well, it's slow, it's a small percentage. But that multiplication means that early on, you don't notice it until it's too late. It's like, November, December 2019, I guess, versus kind of February. And then suddenly it seems like it's appearing, it's too late. And in a way, AI is the same thing. Probably, AI has been going on for decades. There's been hot and cold. And then there's two inflection points which were important around natural language processing and machine vision. And there were key milestones with both. And when they combined, it then brought to the next level. And we're seeing that now. But probably for those who paid attention, we're just caught short maybe with the format of LLMs or whatever. So that exponential profile is one thing. And then the other thing is basically Amara's law. Amara's law is you kind of tend to overestimate initially the impact of a technology or innovation, but underestimate it in the longer term. So you get bored of things because it's just hyped and buzzy, and so you just at some point ignore it. And then when it actually matters, it's too late. Now, the problem with Amara's law and exponential profiles being combined is that Amara's law, you're like bored and hyped and you're kind of aware, but you just think, oh, it's not happening, and then you ignore the metaverse or whatever fashion of the day. And then exponential, it's really growing like crazy at some point, but you're just not noticing it because it's very small until it's too late. And the combination of the two, I think, is why we actually miss change. The more things are happening in different sectors that seem unrelated, and as they connect and intersect, the more that creates different changes, is my humble opinion as to how we miss so much change.
Yeah, and I love that you brought both of those up, because while you say people study exponential thinking and growth in school, I think most people don't actually understand how that works and how it's applied in some of the fringe
For sure,
that we see.
And I meant, you're right, and thanks for clarifying. What I meant by studying exponential was indeed not necessarily in the sense of innovation or discontinuity, but more just in the sense of at school, at some point, many people, if not everyone, would have studied the formula of what exponential looks like without necessarily relating to it or realizing how applicable it is and the traps of it.
And Amara's law as well, both of those touch on observation and the need for us to be paying attention to some of the things that are happening and therefore what they might mean.
Yeah.
So, I mean, you and I spoke a few months ago. It's been a pretty manic start to the year.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you have seen kind of bubble up in the last few months that we should be paying attention to that maybe people are not?
Again, if I apply the dual filters of what I think it causes one to miss inflection points, I think there's a combination of things that are happening. So I think the first one is around technology and AI. I think people are so obsessed now with the noise aspect of it that they're wondering what ChatGPT 4.7 looks like and what the next version is, etc., without realizing that maybe the next breakthroughs will actually not come through large language models, and that you need to really think about what is the value chain of AI. What does it mean that decision making is moving up the value chain? What does it mean if there's autonomous decision making? What does it mean if we're no longer making those decisions and relegating our agency to decision outcomes by machines? And that for me is the big danger, because it's not the small signals you might not be observing. It's like you're just looking at the problematic without realizing the implications of it. And that, I think, is happening with AI, with technologies, which then impact every single industry, digitalization, virtualization, cognification, and it impacts really everything. For positive with a lot of innovations, but also dangerous if society isn't upgrading its own educational systems, governance structures, incentive structures, and you're not adapting to what that looks like to work with machines. I think that's one aspect. And I think that then the other thing is that the 80 years we've known with the sort of Western-led rule-based world might be dismantling. And it's not the first time in history that we have the absence of a rule-based world, because prior to previous 80 years, much of history was like that. So it's not necessarily, something you can't work with. But A, we're not used to it. Pretty much anybody of any age for the past 80 years has been used to some degree of visibility, predictability, understanding of the dynamics between powers. And what does that look like in a non-rule-based world? And then the other thing, without wanting to be unduly negative, because I think some of these changes can create also a lot of opportunities and just different configurations, even though it's not the first time in history that we have non-rule-based world, potentially, it's the first time in history that we'll have that with dynamics, some of which are existential, literally. So AI potentially, nuclear, other technology, and climate. So I think for humanity, the crossroads is some of the things we may not be noticing or may be noticing but not realizing the second or third order implications. How do we react as humanity where we may have the absence of a kind of more predictable and cohesive relationship in terms of geoeconomics and technology and other things, knowing that the stakes are high for good and potentially for bad with those dynamics.
Yeah. And that conflation of lots of different events in and of themselves, some of the ones that you listed are just massive.
Yeah.
But this, we say polycrisis, these multiple crises happening at the same time is a really important part of that. You actually touched on all the questions I had written down for you. But what you did make me think of was in a time where we are feeling like there are just so many things that we don't have a rule book for, that are less predictable. We have less of a predictive historical way to manage them.
Yeah.
There's something else that feeds into that, which is emotion. And I know that you and I are both passionate about philosophy
Yeah.
and bringing that into the field of business and foresight.
Yeah.
So philosophy helps us to navigate some of that as well, is dealing with the human aspect.
Yeah.
Do you think that we're not paying enough attention to that emotional reaction element to all these crises?
No, it's really a fascinating aspect. I mean, fundamentally, I think the way you see the world will inform how you prepare for it and how you respond. So if your model of emotional references and mindset is that change doesn't happen, or that change is necessarily bad, or that everything's a polycrisis, I think it does affect things, because you're either not noticing it and you're caught short, or the danger is a sort of negative narratives. And it's difficult to exercise agency and to be positive about life if it's too negative. And it's true that in the things I mentioned, there are negative things. But I actually feel that polycrisis and permacrisis, I actually don't like those terms, because what they do is that they immediately put a negative connotation. And the idea of narratives, and I think it's the Stockdale paradox for informed optimism, is a question of having some information and being cognizant of what's happening, as opposed to being completely in the dark or naive or pretending otherwise. But still, being somewhere in between, it allows you to have informed optimism. It's but like Snyder Hope theory is like, you need agency and you need pathways to some goals or something. And so what I think is important to your question around emotions and mindset and that is, how do you reconcile things that are very potentially grave or even existential with that? And that's where philosophy comes in, I think, because your incentives, your governance structures, everything is structured around stability, linear predictability, control. Everything is going to be a variation with that. And of course, when you're starting to see fires in LA that are live versus just realizing that climate might be an issue one day, there's suddenly a sense of urgency and negative views. If you think more philosophically or emotionally around, maybe unpredictability also has opportunities, maybe we can now force out the urgency of certain things to resolve climate. I mean, resolve in the sense of addressing certain things. Maybe we can take certain actions to de-risk or to look at different options for career that don't rely on just the fact that your career is going to be exactly what you think it is for the next 30 years and that change happens. That mindset is basically dealing with unpredictability, dealing with plurality of possibilities that might happen, planting seeds in terms of different optionalities. I think that is extremely important to have that kind of emotional intelligence, or whatever one chooses to, or cognitive agility, whatever one chooses to label it, because it is a world which is changing, which is uncertain, where the stakes are high, but both also for good things. The same levers for change that are the dangerous tipping points that we write about and that we skate ourselves with rightly for climate and that, you can also have the same effects for virtuous tipping points. You can also use network platforms to reach a lot of people with ideas and to make changes, which can be also exponential, etc. So anyway, a long-winded way to say that I think anything to do with cognitive agility will inform how you see the world, which will then change how you prepare and that, and the agency you choose to exercise.
Yeah, and the agency piece, I think, is really important, because a lot of these things feel, I think you used the word paralysis in part before. If we don't have the adaptive mindset and skill set, then we have less of an ability to solve problems, which, that's exactly what we need to do, is solve problems, create opportunities, use our agency to make choices.
Yeah.
But sometimes when we talk to very innovative, creative, optimistic people about the future, especially the slightly further out future, it's very much driven by a utopia or a very optimistic vision of the future.
Yeah.
And there's still a choice in there, right? Whether or not we all agree that is the future that we want, and is it a utopia for everybody?
Yeah.
Right.
And listen, you come from different groups and all kinds of initiatives which are very plugged into innovation and to different things. And you're right, one often has, it's almost like the kind of utopian side, which is one aspect, but there's also the dystopian side. So I think the way I look at it is, I think these are false dichotomies, which comes back to the informed optimism versus too optimistic and naive and unrealistic, or too negative. Let's take a simple one with AI. So the utopia, we know it's going to cure every single disease in 2 minutes with no side effects and at no cost for society or humanity or anyone. The dystopia is that you have robo killers that are going to come and kill everything and make you suffer before you die, right? So that's, that's easy. And the thing about these false dichotomies is that, well, one, the media love it. Two, is that it's deferred in the future, so you can not deal with the present reality or with the agency, because it's just like, at some point, robo killers will kill everyone, or at some point, it will solve every single problem that you can imagine. So it's just like, okay, well. And I think the danger of these false dichotomies is that you then have the reality of things that are maybe more urgent. Maybe disinformation and deep fakes are seriously dangerous for many aspects of today's world immediately now. And so the false dichotomies are somehow, I think, dangerous traps, whether it's the utopia or the dystopia, and are very helpful, I think, for those who have the most to gain by spreading these false dichotomies, because they defer to the future, ignore, put the ostrich, the head in the sand, and ignore the reality of the things that are facing you today that are urgent and that are maybe existential in the true existential sense of affecting your decision-making, agency, and choice. And yet you're pushing things in the future. And I think at a time where we're in a world which is liminal, where the future is collapsing with the present, you're seeing it with climate, we're seeing it geoeconomically, and where plausible is more and more possible, those distinctions which, we're talking about foresight, you often have between the future and the present and what's possible and plausible are collapsing. We're seeing things that one would prepare for ahead around climate, around AI, where we're reaching inflection points now because it's nonlinear. And so there's that mixing with the future and the present, which then, to your point around paralysis or the danger or the dystopia or utopia, you have that either hope or fear to the extreme. And so it's really the worst thing for paralysis, which I think is the word we were discussing.
For sure. Yeah. And, ostrich with its head buried was literally a visual that we saw on
it's
the
true.
slide.
You're right, which is very effective.
Which took me back then.
You're right.
But so I think you're staying very true to the futurist kind of way of thinking about things, which is being objective and not necessarily, taking everything in and being very balanced. But I am curious, based on some of the topics that were covered at the Congress or some of what you've heard, what does make you optimistic about the future?
Well, first of all, I think in ways a lot of this is aspirational and is actually can be positive as well. You need to have safeguards for some of the side effects, but some of them, I think it's good that we're working on them, and it's maybe good to be slightly utopian as long as the side effects are contained. So some of the things we touched upon around precision medicine, preventive aspects of healthcare, some of the things around gene editing, curing diseases. And we do see over time in history that things we thought were impossible in terms of diseases or whatever were cured. Maybe there is a cure for cancer. Maybe we can find it. And longevity, if we're living healthier and we can sustain ourselves as humanity and individually and in a fulfilling way, why not? Longevity, and not talking about living 3 years more, but, the big numbers from some of our colleagues. And then for some that are even more out there, for me, I'm, don't adhere to that perspective. And I don't know if it's a positive thing, but, you can go even push the needle or whatever to immortality and that. But I think without going to the extreme, or maybe for some it's not an extreme, for me it is, of immortality, I think even just, those areas which are curing things that we can't cure, of improving healthcare, of democratizing, even the talk you did, which was fascinating, around the future of food and the cost element of that and the scaling, knowing that there are resources that are limited, but there are alternative ways of maybe feeding the planet and democratizing that everybody is sustainable equally as much as possible. These things are positive, The only sort of closing comment I'd make on this positive thing is that, you do need guardrails, and there can't be a substitute for the things that are charging at you now and that are urgent that you need to address.
Yeah.
So if you're focusing exclusively on those wonderful curing, a million things without today making sure people are addressing the mental challenges of the world, the other social aspects and healthcare of everything we eat every day today, with the view of maybe one day curing some rare disease. If you're pushing everything to that, or AI, whatever, I think that's where the challenge happens. So that's the kind of agency and balance of, hitting the different things that are happening in the different time frames and not exclusively focusing on,
Yeah, it's almost a paradox, right? Like the more that you spend time focusing on the further out future,
Yeah,
and we've seen that with government policies,
yeah,
right, where we're not making those generational
yeah.
policies.
No, totally. And that's the advantage. I mean, I know we're both passionate about Foresight, but those governments, Finland or to a degree Canada, Singapore, that do have, a capability that feeds into policy that has longer time horizons, it's to avoid some of these dichotomies between, future, longer term and present,
Yeah,
and make sure that they
yeah,
feed into policy and budget and public spending
yeah.
without sacrificing too much one or the other.
Yeah, I mean, they sit within a set of rules, and rules can be very important and helpful. But in line with the theme of the conference, obviously, which rule would you break? Actually, I would love to hear your response on that in the context of Foresight.
It's nice. It's so what rule would one break? Well, I'm gonna put something out there. Foresight is an interest in thinking in a structured way of the longer term implications and the next order implications, and trying to bring that to inform decision making today, and ideally to build resiliency and be more future prepared, etc. And this is interesting because our podcast was earlier this year, which is not that long ago.
Yeah.
But I personally feel that because of some of the things we talked about, the inflection points and that are happening concomitantly or that could happen, I think there's a degree of urgency whereby we have to challenge the field and Foresight as to whether some of the scenarios that one would be preparing for typically are actually very close, potentially, because of the inflection points, and that we actually need to bring a lot of the kind of future thinking to the immediate emergence here and now. Some of it might be improvising because we just don't know with climate. I think, at some point when you're videoing on your iPhone, your house burning, it's not the same thing as 20 years ago thinking that it's happening. And so I think that you need to start thinking about resiliency and adaptation. Maybe for the Foresight field, and it's always been that we think longer term scenarios to inform decision making today, but I think here it's beyond informing decision making today. It's really realizing that we need the equivalent of scenarios for resiliency and adaptation today. That a cognitive, strategic, and emergent agility in the here and now to really be a very significant, if not disproportionate, part of the longer term planning. Because if not, there may be no longer term,
Yeah, I love that. Bring Foresight closer in. It's a huge way for us to make a bigger impact is to, going back to what we said before, meet people where they are.
Yeah.
So I love that. I'm going to release the full episode with Roger very, very soon. I can't wait for everyone to listen to it. And thank you for doing the teaser today.
Amazing. And thanks for doing what you're doing. Looking Outside is one of the most thoughtful and varied podcasts. So thank you so much.